I never really thought about doing this kind of writing. My entire experience in writing up to the point at which David Simon called me to ask me to be a writer on this show was fiction writing. Classic, you sit at a desk and you write narrative. Or you write nonfiction of the type that Maureen read so well earlier. So the difference is that, I should tell you a little bit just about the template of the room and how it works. It's not, the writing process is a combination of collaborative work and individual work. So there are 6 writers, say, for this first season that you just saw the excerpt from. There are 6 writers in the writer's room. And, it's David Simon, who's the creator of the show, along with Eric Overmyer, who's also a writer in the room. David Simon, of course, being the creator of The Wire and The Corner and Homicide and a lot of other sort of landmark episodic television productions. Eric Overmyer is his co-creator, and then David Mills, who is a great television writer and was just an amazing person to have in the room with us. Marvelous novelist from DC named George Pelecanos. Some of you probably know his work, writes crime fiction. And then fellow New Orleanian, Lolis Eric Eli, who was a columnist for the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans newspaper. And then they invited Lolis and me to be writers on the show, which was, really a kind of a gutsy thing to do with people who had never done this before. 2 out of the 6 people in the room. So when we got together, it became clear very quickly what the sort of dimensions of the playing field were. We all got together in a suite at the Hotel Montleone and sat around, and David Simon and Eric Overmyer had planned out who the basic characters were going to be. And a show like this begins to address your question, is very complex to write for because I think there are 8 different characters, 7 or 8 different characters who have what we call in the TV world point of view, which is to say the camera can be with them and you don't need somebody else, right? So you can go to their plot area and follow them through a day. There are certain characters who you'd never be alone with. The camera would never be alone with. But there are, I think, 8 characters who the camera can be alone with. And they were, you saw Wendell Pierce in the black leather jacket who played Bunk, so famously on The Wire. He plays a trombonist named Antoine Baptiste. There's Melissa Leo, who plays a civil rights lawyer, Tony Burnett. John Goodman in season 1 plays her husband, who's an English professor and failed novelist. There's the little pair of musicians who you saw. The woman in the red coat is Lucia Micarelli. She plays a violinist named Annie, and her sort of no-good-nick boyfriend, Sonny. Anyway, there are all these different characters. And later on, Steve Zahn, who plays that kind of, I don't know how well you know. How many of you have actually seen the show? That would help you know. Okay, about happy. Steve Zahn plays this kind of feckless pianist, DJ, womanizer, but with a good heart. But he's always trying these different hustles, none of which end up working. And in that scene that you saw there with the great Elizabeth Ashley drinking the martini, that character, whose name is Davis in the show, is running for city council with this very quixotic run for a position he'll never, ever be elected to. So that's what they're discussing there. So the trick in writing a show where you have 8 different characters who you're following and interlacing like that is to shuffle the deck of the different scenes so that you're going back and forth among these different characters so that the pace never flags too much. And if you set up one event, if we show more from the video later, you'll see subsequently they were talking about going to the musician's clinic, Wendell Pierce and the trombonist. Well, later you'll see them go to the musician's clinic. Sometimes you split these scenes and you want to keep it so that the tension on the line, I'm kind of rambling, it's a kind of unfocused, where the tension on the line never goes slack. So that you're always aware of what happened last with each character. So you never go too long until you revisit that character. But you don't do it too often in series and lose track of the other characters. So it's an art, just doing that. So that's the sort of specific, you said, challenge in doing that. And what happens in the writer's room is you focus all together, all 6 writers focus on each character individually. So David Simon and Eric Overmyer came into the room initially with a provisional sense of where each character was going to start out in the season and where they were going to end up by the end of the season, assuming we got a first season, which you don't know. When you're in the original planning stages, all you really know at that point in the first meeting is, we're going to film a pilot in March, a first episode, and then we're going to generate maybe 3 or 4 more scripts to show to HBO. So HBO provided the money to film a pilot and then to write some more scripts. And so based on that, HBO will decide whether or not you go and film a full season. So that's all we know. So Simon and Overmyer come in and they say, okay, we have this character, this character, this character. This character starts here. By the end of the season, we want this character to be, let's say we're in this room, okay. We're going to start the season. James is going to be working as a lowly office boy at Amazon. By the end of the season, James is going to be the president of Amazon. All right. And then Cal Morgan, at the beginning of the season, is going to be a very well-respected editor in New York City. Very, very powerful and respected. By the end of the season, he's going to be playing piano in a little dive bar in Sandusky, Ohio. It could change. It could change. And for each character, there's a kind of provisional notion, okay, we're going to start here, they're going to end there. Right? And we have a general sense of, if we go to season, the action of the show is going to begin at a certain moment, and then it's going to finish off at a moment. Now, with this season, what we had was a sense of that the action was going to start 3 months after Hurricane Katrina, or 4 months after, I think it's 3 months after Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast. So, which is to say November, more or less. And we knew it was going to end up in the spring of the next year, which was 2006. So we had roughly, 8 months, something like that, to deal with. And we knew that if we went to season, we were going to have 10 episodes. So, okay, 10 episodes, 8 months, so you figure the first episode will be mid-November, the second episode maybe will be Thanksgiving, the third episode might be the run-up to the holidays, maybe the fourth episode is going to be somewhere around New Year's, maybe the fifth episode is some kind of post-New Year's parade that begins happening. All right, and so you know by episode 10 we're going to end up on St. Joseph's Night in the late spring of 2006, right? So with that, you begin, what enters the equation is you know, well, okay, in January of 2006, that's when they turned the water back on in the 7th Ward. That's when they had this big issue with the police. That's in March is when this happened. So you begin to fill in these blanks, and things suggest themselves for the characters to be concerned with, at specific historical moments. Because, of course, the season is about these individual characters, but it's also about New Orleans. It's also about how a community rebuilds itself in every sense, economically, but spiritually, and how its sense of life comes back from a new type of experience. So anyway, so there are all these different little moments that you can sort of tie onto, tie a line onto and hoist yourself up 10 seasons worth. So what you do is you sit down for each character, for each episode. Let's say Cal Morgan, okay, episode 1, he's the president of HarperCollins, let's say. He starts out there. And we say, okay, we want to have a few beats for Cal, and we want to plant the seeds of why he's going to leave and become a pianist in this little dive bar. Okay, so let's say the first beat, okay, somebody says, well, maybe he has a piano in his office, and he's like playing. That's the first time we see him, he's playing, and like his assistant comes in, hears him, winces, and turns to the secretary and goes, I don't look at it. And somebody else goes, no, wait. maybe the piano's not in his office, maybe the piano's in a storage room on another floor, and he's always ducking out, and he's never there. And somebody else, that's better, because then we can play people come to the office and he's not there, and it creates a tension. Somebody else goes, yeah, well, what kind, he's the head of the corporation. Somebody else goes, okay, well, maybe he's not the head. Maybe he's like, you know, a VP, and there's somebody above him who's noticing his truancy when he's going down to the 7th floor playing the piano. Somebody else goes, well, maybe he can have the piano in his office and the music is bothering the person who's above him. Somebody else goes, no, we can't play that because that's, who's going to... All right, so that's the kind of conversation that keeps going. Then finally, out of this, you begin to kind of tease out, like a spider web, you begin to tease out these filaments of plot that are going to run through each character, through each, they're like, you know, you string beads on it, and the beads are little scenes. So, okay, we finally agreed that the first scene is going to be the president coming into the office, and Cal's not there. Where is he? Hard cut, 7th floor storage room, Cal's playing piano, knock on the door. Okay, and maybe the second scene is a meeting in the president's office. And then the third scene is some, okay, so we get 5 little scenes for Cal, and for the first episode. Then for James, same thing. And for Reba and her scene. Right. So each character, you get about 5 or 6 different little, what we call beats, because they're not always full scenes. So they're nodal moments that advance your notion of what's possible for the character or the relationship. Right? And you get those for each character. And then you begin to put together an outline for each episode that shuffles those beats together. So you have a Cal beat, then you have a James beat, then you have a Reba beat, then maybe you have another James beat, then you have a Cal beat, then you have a Noreen beat, then you have, you know, so you figure it out so that it makes a logical progression through the episode. So that's how it comes together. So the challenge is to make each scene really tell, not bog down, not be too superficial.
But it sounds almost like in that scenario that you're writing each episode, the 6 people in the room are writing it together. So I have a couple of questions about that. One is, in watching the series, I see the credits and I'll see episode 6, Tom Piazza, or one writer credited with an episode as the writer of it. So I'm curious about how that unfolds. And then 2, I'm really curious about someone who's used to being alone in a room writing, not even writing for theater, but being alone in a room writing, suddenly being in a room with 6 people. So can you talk a little bit about those 2 things?
Sure. What happens is we come out of these meetings with little outlines for each, provisional outlines for each episode. Pardon me. So, and then each writer is dealt an episode. So we say, okay, you know, David Simon's going to write episode 1, Eric, you write episode 2, David Mills writes episode 3, I think this is actually the way I wrote season 1. George Pelicanos wrote episode 4, Lola Eli wrote episode 5, and then I wrote episode 6. It's just kind of dealt out that way. So what you do is you take this outline, which is usually in the form of index cards. You write all this, or you write these different little beats on index cards, put them up on a board, and then you shuffle them together, and you have a little actual sort of flip book of scenes. And you take that back to your room, and then the individual writer writes the individual episode. So you have so in a way, you know, the fiction writers in here will know what I'm talking about. When you're writing, you know, a novel, certainly, as you're writing each scene, you're constantly advancing against the subtle or not so subtle resistance that's being offered by the fact that you're not sure if this is going to end up panning out or not. In other words, you could end up spending, you know, haven't we all done it? You know, you end up spending 2 months on a scene or a sequence that you end up cutting completely. You know, you end up trashing a lot of stuff. So you can put some of your finest energy into material that just never ends up seeing the light of day. Now, in this format, what happens is demands of production are such that you don't, but by the time you get to the point that you're going to your room with, you're writing your own personal writing room with the outline, you don't have you can't just kind of say, well, let's reconceive this episode. This is the template you have. Now, there's a certain amount of freedom within it. For instance, in that episode, I think it was that episode, when I was writing it, there was a scene, we had a scene where one of the characters, LaDonna, she's looking for her brother. Her brother, this one character, African-American character who owns a bar, her brother disappeared after the storm. And there's some sense that he might have been taken into police custody and then never found. She's trying to find him. And the lawyer, played by Melissa Leo, is helping her. So there was one scene where in the writers' meeting we decided that she would go to this house in the neighborhood where some drug guys are dealing with and ask one of them if she had seen, if that dealer had seen her brother. And I tried to write that thing, and it wasn't playing. It wasn't playing. It was forced. It wasn't the logic of her character at that moment. She wasn't going to do that. And so I left the scene out. I just said, we don't, because it wasn't structurally necessary. It was more of a grace note than anything else. So you have that kind of discretion with a lot of things. But more true than not to say that once you get to the desk, you follow this outline. And if you have a knack for dialogue, and you know, if I have a little pride as a writer in one or two things I do well, I think probably dialogue has probably always been among the things that I felt most happy about doing. It came most easily to me, and I think I'm most effective with. So it is different writing dialogue, of course, for characters to speak, for actors to speak, you know, than it is to write for people to read, for a reader to read. But I found I made that transition pretty easily. So I found it very relaxing, actually, because I didn't have that tension of, oh crap, you know, I'm going to write all this stuff and then it's a chance I might just end up having to throw it away. You didn't have that tension at work there. So that's it, you go and write it. But then once you write it, of course, you know, David Simon and Eric Overmyer had their way with it. You know, you deliver it here. Isn't it beautiful? And I'm like, yes, it's very beautiful. It's terrible. They're really diabolical people. But I got my revenge, though, because one of the other things that happens is that very often scenes get bumped from one episode to another episode. So you can, and this happens, you can write a great scene and it could end up 3 episodes later. Because as they're looking at the whole season, they're like, no, you know, it's, Dave Williams can't become, you know, a parachute jumper in the 3rd episode. It's, we got to do that later because too much stuff has to, all right, so we'll just take these scenes and put them in episode 8 instead of episode 3. Voila. So that happens all the time. So one of David Simon's scenes ended up in my episode. And I was able to have my way with his scene. Which is right. And in fact, it was that first scene with John Goodman and Melissa Leo. Simon had written it. He was very proud of it. I was like, yes, that's wonderful. Just marvelous. And but it was funny because he said, listen, he said, just there was a line which I thought got a little bit lost in it, but there was a line where I think Sophia, the daughter who's wearing the costume, says, "The sperm lead the way." And Melissa, the character Tony Burnett, says, "As sperm so often do." And that was Simon's. He said, "Whatever you do, don't lose that line." I can do that for you. But anyway, that was the first part of the question. Then you asked me the second part about, you said, what do you do as the writer? And then you said something else.
Well, I wondered in both directions how hard it is for you as a writer who writes mostly alone to do that, but then also how the process of doing it reflects back when you go back and work on a novel. Is your writing changed by having worked in TV?
Good, yes, right. Okay, let me preface this by saying that I was wary, actually, going into this a little bit. I do want to say one thing about the experience of being in the room before I get into it. I didn't find it a natural, I found it very natural to work on actually writing the script. I didn't find it natural to be in the writer's room tossing ideas back and forth. That's not the way I work. I've got a very different way. For better or for worse, I often find that I have to know something is right. I work by feel. I'm feeling my way blind most of the time when I'm writing. And I have to have the sense of, it clicks into place, I know it's right. And you're alone at the desk, you wait for it to happen. I don't know, there's probably some hunting analogy. You wait for it, I don't know. But in the writer's room, you're always throwing out hypotheses. What if, what if, what if? I don't work doing what if. You know, it feels so wrong to me. So I was uncomfortable with it. The only thing was, the other writers in the room were so freaking good. You gotta just take my word for it. Sitting in there with especially Simon and Obermeyer and David Mills, who had been working together for so long, it was like watching Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie or something. I mean, they were really like, one guy would start something, the other guy would finish it, and it was thrilling. It was thrilling, and I got better. I got better at it. I saw, okay, this isn't a violation of everything I've ever held dear. This is just just a different way of approaching it. And so I was able to relax a little bit and enjoy it. And so by the end, or sort of by the middle of the first season, I was swinging along, the rest of the Miles Davis quintet. But going back to the writers, going back to my own room, working on a novel, I was wary about going into the experience. I don't think I ever seriously considered not doing it because it was just a door opening into something that was so extraordinary that you just sort of don't say no to something like that unless there's a really, really, really good reason. And I knew I would learn a lot. But the flip side of it is there are certain writers who you can see who have done a lot of film work or a lot of television work. And sometimes you can feel the effect of it in the written narrative. There's a bit too much, it's almost a certain schematic element can creep in. I was wary about that. So that being said, I would say that the biggest thing that I probably have learned in the process of writing for this series, and now we're in our third season, so in fact, as soon as I get back to New Orleans, we begin writers' meetings on January 4th for my episode for season 3. But I think what I learned above all was to zero in on a sense of what makes a scene a scene. And this is something that's exportable from, with caveats, with asterisks. But to a degree, it is exportable from writing for film or video to writing a novel, which is to say, what do you dramatize and what do you not dramatize? Now, in a novel, you obviously have other resources available to you than are purely dramatic. So the author can talk to the reader, you can have description, there's all kinds of stuff you can do. Switch points of view. Most of them have their analog in film or video work, but the question of what do you actually dramatize and what do you just do in sort of expository terms, authorial exposition, is a crucial question. There's no real analog for exposition in TV drama, unless you had one of those old films with a voiceover. That was 2 weeks earlier. In the interim, Scout and I went up to the country and he caught 3 rabbits, or whatever. But you can have one of those old voiceover things. But generally speaking, there's no real analog to exposition. So a lot of times when you're writing, I find, in my experience, writing fiction, you write things as a scene just because you're trying to figure out what happened at a certain moment. But that doesn't mean it needs to be dramatized. You just sort of need to know what happened. And sometimes you write it as a scene and you can end up just cutting the scene or managing it authorially in a sentence or two. So I think that writing for, seeing what kinds of choices Simon and Overmyer would make for what to play, what to dramatize, what to actually film, and what not to film, what to handle in dialogue, what to actually play, was really educational for me. I wouldn't always make the same choices, the same kinds of choices in writing a novel, but it sharpened the kinds of questions I asked about what to dramatize.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's another issue, I think. You wrote so compellingly in just about every form you could in the aftermath of Katrina about New Orleans. Why New Orleans Matters, essays, City of Refuge, just getting out there and trying to tell the story of New Orleans however you could. And Treme, there are sections or characters in Treme that are John Goodman character, for example, that are based on things that really happened in New Orleans to a certain extent. And also the timeline has to use somewhat to the timeline of what happened in the aftermath. How do you feel about what's emphasized, what's not emphasized? You're now in a situation where you're telling the story of New Orleans in a very powerful medium as part of a team. And is there ever a moment where you feel like you want this more emphasized or that more emphasized, or are you satisfied with the image overall? I'm sure you are. I'm sure we all are in a way of the image Treme gives. When in a way it's not yours.
Yeah, good. It's a good question. If I had negative feelings about it, I probably couldn't answer it entirely honestly, but luckily I don't. Here's the thing. The first season was actually, how can I say this? It was almost, remember the mathematical word congruent? It was almost congruent to, like occupied the same space and the same dimensions and the same weight as my sense of post-Katrina New Orleans. And I don't, one thing that was true was I know that Why New Orleans, this short book that I wrote after the disaster called Why New Orleans Matters, was an important book actually for the production. Everybody who worked for the production got a copy of the book and was told to read it, which was an incredible compliment, needless to say. I've talked to grips or line producers, and they said, "Yeah, they gave us your book," so which was a beautiful thing, believe it. And so in a way, it was almost like a teabag suffused. It was like that book was there, and it kind of suffused the production in a funny kind of way for season one, certainly, because season one was about what the book was really about, what the book had for its fulcrum, which is to say, how do you come back after this? How do you come back? How do you survive? How do you possibly go on after, knowing that your mother drowned in the attic of the house that you grew up in, or in the dining room of the house that you grew up in, with a refrigerator that had floated in the floodwater coming to rest on her, which is how they found her. How do you build a life after that? How do you make jokes after that? How do you enjoy food after that? Etc. So that was what I was thinking about in Why New Orleans Matters and in my novel City of Refuge. And that was what season one was about, because the answers that it proffered were essentially the same, if answers is the right word, the same answers I was proffering, which is to say it's a shared culture. It gives a sense of continuity to people's lives. And in New Orleans, that culture is very much based around food, music, communal celebration, dance, a way of joking, a whole consortium of images and smells and tonalities that people grow up with, that reassembled itself like a brain reassembling itself after a stroke after the storm. It's a miracle, honestly. But so the first season was a kind of almost an embodiment in dramatic terms of not that they were like taking their plays from a playbook I've written, but I saw it was very close to my vision. Now, beginning in season 2, as a dramatic series, once okay, we're still alive, but oh yes, I can't get insurance for my house. Oh yes, there's all kinds of catch-22s going around. Oh yes, my best friend committed suicide. Oh yes, we can't find a place for the members of the gang to live. Oh yes, well, all right. So season 2 became much more about the nuts and bolts of once you're back from the dead, now what? So now, it was very interesting to write that. I thought season 2 was terrific. I was very proud of season 2, but it wasn't as close to my heart because I approached things more from the cultural, spiritual angle, if you will, And season 2, that one kind of moved a little bit more into those of you who have seen The Wire, with its very, very specific address to questions of civic management, malfeasance, what have you, to the mechanics of how things work. I wish I were more interested in that. As a novelist, I wish I were more interested in that.